Chapter 43. That night I dreamed of being holed up by myself in the old shelter where I lived with Pat. Bigfoots came out of the forest and tore at the walls. I sat on the hide pile and clutched my rifle, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good against something as large as a Bigfoot. Eventually, I crawled into the stage 2 box through the muddy hole at the back of the shelter. I heard the Bigfoots digging at the ground. Before long, they were banging on the top of the box with their fists and scratching the door with their fingernails. I felt them rolling it out of the ground like a piece of culvert pipe and working themselves into a howling frenzy. Then, suddenly, I couldn't hear them anymore. I saw the doorknob to the little steel door at the end of the pipe begin to jiggle. I waited while my heart thumped loudly in my chest. When I woke up, Officer Pete was opening the door to my jail cell. "Let's go, kid." I sat up and looked about. Getting my bearings, I rubbed my eyes while he waited with hands on his hips. "Let's go," he said again. "I don't have all day." I put on my hat and grabbed Kit's. "You want to put some handcuffs on me?" I asked. "We don't put handcuffs on kids," he said. "You're no threat to me." I followed him into the office. As we approached the outside door, he turned to me. "Stay close and don't stop to answer any questions. Just get in the car." I didn't know why he told me that, but I got up next to him. When he opened the door, I understood what he was talking about. Cameras were flashing and people were everywhere. "Hey, Moon," they shouted at me. "Say something for us, Moon." "Who's your lawyer, Alabama Moon?" "We heard you've got a lawyer. Why'd you turn yourself in?" I grabbed Officer Pete's belt loop and he pulled me along to the squad car. He opened the back door and I jumped in. I sat up on the seat and watched the people gathering around and flash bulbs going off near the window. "Wait for me, Moon." "Bury your teeth for us." I looked at Officer Pete in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the crowd. He glanced back at me and shook his head. "You're a real pain in the butt, you know." "I didn't do anything to those people out there." "For somebody that hasn't ever done anything, you sure do have a bunch of folks stirred up." "We going to see the judge?" "That's right. That's what you wanted, isn't it?" "I was just wondering." "I'd be more than just wondering if I were you." He's pretty pissed off over all of this. He wants to know just what he's going to do with a 10-year-old who shot at a law enforcement officer. "I told you. I know what you said. But you've got a half-crazed constable from Sumter County that says he'll swear on the Bible otherwise. He'll be lying." "Why would he lie about something like that?" "I don't know." Officer Pete shook his head. "I don't know either," he said. Officer Pete took me into the courthouse through a back entrance where there weren't any reporters. He put me into another cage and left me alone. I sat there for an hour before he came back again. "All right," he said. "Judge Mackin's ready for you. He said if you get to acting crazy on him, he's going to put you in a straitjacket." "What's that?" "Something you won't like. Now come on." When I walked into the courtroom, the first person I saw was Sanders. He sat in the front row and stared at me with a swollen face. He wore no expression and seemed to look right through me. My heart started beating faster when I saw Mr. Wellington in front on the other side of the courtroom. He was dressed in a three-piece suit and his hair was slicked back behind a face that was scrubbed shiny. Except for a judge at the entrance, the only other person in the room was Judge Mackin. He sat behind his desk on a raised platform in the front of the room with one elbow on the desk and his cheek pressed into his palm. He had white curly hair, a pink face, and droopy eyes that reminded me of a wild hog. Glasses that perched at the end of his nose, and I heard him breathing heavily. When he spoke, he sounded tired. "What's that on his head, Officer Pete?" "It's his squirrel hat, Your Honor." "Well, get him to take it off," the judge mumbled. "Yes, Your Honor. You know better than that. I don't care how old he is." "Take off the hat, Moon." I took it off and put it under my arm with Kit's hat. The judge moved his eyes to watch me as I followed behind Officer Pete over to where Mr. Wellington stood. "Why does he have two?" the judge asked. "It's all I've got left," I replied. The judge squinted at me. "Was I talking to you?" "No, sir." "Then stay quiet until somebody asks you a question." "Yes, sir." Officer Pete dropped me off next to Mr. Wellington, and I felt proud to have him on my side. I smiled up at him. "I thought you'd left me," I said. Mr. Wellington put his finger to his lips and motioned for me to watch the judge. Felt him pull my hats from beneath my arm and saw him set them on the table in front of us. I looked at the judge and then over at Sanders. His eyes danced like the inside of his head was on fire. Now, Judge Mackin said as he removed his reading glasses and began to clear them with a handkerchief. We've got an unusual situation here. Because of that, I'm closing this hearing to the public. Another reason for that is I've got a bad headache and all those people out there are driving me crazy. He set his glasses on the desk. Moon Blake, he said, you've stirred up quite a commotion out there. I don't like commotion. I don't like people who shoot at our law enforcement officers. I don't like people who eat other people's dogs. Sanders is a liar, I said. Hey, the judge snapped, did I ask you a question? I looked at Mr. Wellington and put his finger to his lips again. The judge licked his mouth and turned to Sanders. Okay, then let's get started. Mr. Sanders, why don't you come up here and give me your side of the story? I'm a constable, Your Honor. Whatever. Get up here. Sanders acted like he was about to say something, but twisted his mouth around and stood up. He walked to the front of the room and stood before the judge. The judge winced and shook his head slowly. What did you get into? Poison ivy, he said. The judge jerked his head up and pointed his finger at me as his eyes grew wide. Mr. Wellington bent over and whispered in my ear, Moon, you can't speak in here unless you get permission. The judge continued to watch me as he held the book sideways towards Sanders. You not gonna tell a lie, are you? Sanders put his hand on the book and shook his head. No, he said. Good, the judge replied. He put the book on his desk. Go on, then. Sanders took a deep breath and sat down. I'm going to tell this one more time. You'll tell it as many times as I want you to tell it. Just because your daddy's a small-time judge over there in Scepter County doesn't mean you're going to get any kind of special treatment. I saw the veins on Sanders' forehead stand up as he clenched his teeth. He stared at the back of the room, at some place on the wall behind us. After a second, his veins relaxed and he continued. This boy's the son of an outlaw. Mr. Wellington stood up. Irrelevant, Your Honor. The judge sighed. Mr. Sanders, it seems we've got a fancy big city lawyer to deal with today, and he's right. Sustained. Did this boy attempt to shoot you or not? He did. With what? A pistol. What kind? 45. Where'd he get it? He stole it from me. The judge leaned back in his chair and watched Sanders. He stole it from you? Sanders' veins rose again and relaxed. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked at me. I nodded to him and his eyes grew wide. Are you agreeing that you stole it from him or that you shot at him? I stole it from him, I said, but I never shot at anybody. I turned back to Sanders. Well, the kid admits he stole your gun. How did you let that happen? I leaned forward, but Mr. Wellington pulled me back. I saw Sanders kneading his hands together. He was still staring at some place in the rear wall. I was asleep, he said. He's lying, I whispered to Mr. Wellington. The judge cocked his eyes at me. It's all right, Mr. Wellington said quietly. We can tell the judge when it's our turn to talk. The judge continued to watch me out of the corner of his eyes while he talked to Sanders. So he got your gun while you were asleep. What next? He just backed up and pointed it at me and shot in my stomach and missed. Then he turned and ran off and took your pistol with him. That's right. Judge Mackin wrote something down. After a second, he said, Okay, tell me about the dogs. I sent 3 tracking dogs after him and the 2 other boys that broke out of Pinson Boy's home. I heard the dogs yelping. Later on, I found their carcasses hanging from a tree, guts laying everywhere, meat clean to the bone. And you say the boy bit you too? Yes, Your Honor, he did. What else? That's it. The judge sat back in his chair and looked at Mr. Wellington. Okay, lawyer, your turn. Mr. Wellington stood calmly and made his way to the front of the courtroom. He faced Sanders. Mr. Sanders, where were you when Moon supposedly shot at you with your pistol? Sanders looked straight at Mr. Wellington's eyes. I was in the Talladega National Forest. Describe your surroundings. I don't remember. You mean you were lost out in the forest and then shot at, and you don't remember anything about your surroundings? Who said I was lost? Just an assumption. Perhaps I'm wrong. Listen here, you slick old sumbee. The judge slammed his gavel on the desk without lifting his cheek from his palm. I jumped in my chair from surprise. Sanders paused for a moment and then spoke calmly. I was near a creek, I think. You think? Yeah, I was beside a creek. And Moon Blake shot at you once. That's right. Once? That's right. How far away was he when he shot? About 10 yards, I guess. Close. And you saw the remains of your dogs not far from there. That's right. I see, Mr. Wellington said. Can I remind you, Mr. Sanders, that you're under. He knows he's under oath, Mr. Wellington, the judge said wearily. Stop fancy pantsing around and get on with it. Sanders looked over at the judge. Your Honor, I thought this was going to be an informal hearing. How come I got this lawyer in my face? I can't keep the boy from having his own counsel, Mr. Sanders. Sanders shook his head and looked back at Mr. Wellington. Well, ask what you're going to ask, Slick. Mr. Wellington nodded politely. You say you saw the carcasses of your dogs not far from where the shooting took place. That's right. Are you sure it wasn't a single deer carcass that Moon had left not far from there? You don't think I know a deer carcass from a dog carcass? And I said there were three. Very well, Mr. Wellington nodded. He walked to the table where I sat. He reached beside me and pulled a plastic bag from his briefcase. Inside the bag was Sanders' pistol. He held it up. Is this your pistol, Mr. Sanders? Sanders' forehead veins popped up again, and his eyes grew wide. He stood and held out his hand for it. Mr. Wellington walked over to him and held it in front of him, just out of reach. Well, Sanders said, let me see the thing. You can see it fine, the judge said. Sit down. Yeah, it looks like mine. Give me that. Mr. Wellington swung the pistol away and laid it on the judge's desk. The judge stared at it for a second and then looked at Mr. Wellington. Go on. That's my pistol he stole, Sanders said as he reached for it. Get your hand away from my desk, the judge snapped. I said sit down. Sanders clutched his teeth, sat, and stared at the black wall. Mr. Wellington waited a few seconds and continued. Mr. Sanders? What? Did you shoot the pistol at all that day before Moon supposedly took it from you and fired at you? No. And he only fired at you once. That's what I said. How many shells does that pistol hold? 9 in the clip and 1 in the chamber. Mr. Wellington turned to the judge. Your Honor, if you examine the clip, you'll see that there are 8 bullets in it. The bullets are oxidized against the clip, evidence that they've been in there and positioned in such a way for some time and have not been tampered with. Sanders smiled and shook his head. Maybe you shot it again, Slick. Mr. Wellington nodded. Yes, he did. Moon shot the pistol twice. Sanders shrugged his shoulders and looked at the judge. Can I go, Your Honor? The judge looked at Mr. Wellington. The lawyer held up his finger and walked to his briefcase. He pulled out some pictures and another small plastic bag with 2 bullets in it. He took these to the judge and set them on his desk. Again, the judge looked down and eyed them. What is all that? It's a picture of a log with 2 bullets in it. In that bag are the only 2 bullets that were shot out of the pistol. As you know, there are tests that can prove the bore markings on those bullets match Mr. Sanders' pistol. If you examine this picture and others I have taken of the log, and I even had the log itself, if that becomes necessary, you will see these bullets are the same ones that were embedded in the log. Sanders stood up. So maybe he fired twice at me. Heck, when you're getting shot at, you lose track of things. This time, the judge lifted his cheek from his palm and stared at Sanders. If I have to tell you to sit down one more time, I'm going to throw some rope around you and that chair. Sanders sat with his hands shaking on top of the armrest. Mr. Wellington turned to me and winked. Moon, he said, how is it that we know this log was nowhere near Mr. Sanders at the creek? All of a sudden, I knew what he was doing. The answer to his question shot into my head and seemed like it was ringing a bell inside me. 'Cause there aren't any pine logs by creeks. They're all up at the top of the hill. Sanders started to get up, but sat down again and leaned forward in his seat. That's the craziest dang. Hey, the judge said. Craziest dang defense, Sanders mumbled. The judge shot him a look, and Sanders settled into his chair. Mr. Wellington turned and began walking toward a table. When his back was to the judge, he looked up and smiled at me. After Mr. Wellington sat down, the courtroom was quiet, and everyone watched the judge. He rubbed his temples and stared at the top of his desk. I'm not sure what's been accomplished here, he said to the desk. Bullets in a log, bore markings, inconsistencies in the number of shots. This is pretty shaky, Wellington. Maybe that log rolled down the hill. Maybe it washed up on the creek bank. Mr. Wellington nodded. I've thought of that, Your Honor. With your permission, I'd like to make a few more points. The judge looked up and sighed. Good, that would be helpful. I'd like to introduce my second piece of evidence, my client here, Moon Blake. Bring him up, then. Actually, with your permission, I'd like to demonstrate something outside the courtroom. I believe your police department has a shooting range not far outside of town. I'd like to go there for my demonstration. Sanders twisted in his chair and threw up his hands. The judge stared at Mr. Wellington for what seemed like a long time. Finally, he said, Wellington, I think this is going to be a waste of my time. You and your fancy talk may work with the jury, but I can cut it down to what it is. You're not in the big city anymore. However, this is your lucky day. I don't feel good at all. You give me a nap, and I'll take your country drive with you. He tapped the gavel on his desk. Reconverse in 2 hours. Meet me in the garage so we don't start a parade with all those reporters out there. Chapter 44. Mr. Wellington said he'd see me later, and Officer Pete took me back to the cage to wait while the judge took his nap. I was there for what seemed like a lot longer than 2 hours before Officer Pete came again to get me. Let's go, kid. He took me down some stairs into the basement where the judge was already in the front passenger side of a police car, staring straight ahead. You feeling better? I asked. I don't know, Officer Pete said. He opened the back door and I climbed inside. We drove up from the basement and out into the sunshine. I turned to see all the people still gathered around the courthouse steps. Some of them had grown tired and were sitting down. A couple were lying on the park benches out front with their cameras on the ground beside them. No one seemed to notice we were leaving. The judge rolled his window down, and I was relieved to feel the cool air brush across the back seat. We hadn't gone far when I saw Mr. Wellington pull up behind us in a shiny car I'd never seen before. Then we saw Sanders in his car, and the judge turned in his seat as we passed by. Pete, where do you think he drives to get a car that's scratched up and muddy? He's been all over looking for me, I said. The judge glanced at Officer Pete and then back at me. He started to say something, but then didn't and faced the road again. After a few seconds, he started shaking his head. Stop here and get me a hamburger, Pete. This boy had lunch? No, sir. Get us all something then. What do you want? Officer Pete asked me. Sausage biscuit? They don't have sausage biscuits right now. I'll get you a hamburger. Okay. We pulled up to a drive-through restaurant, and Officer Pete told the sign that he wanted 3 hamburgers and 3 Cokes. After the woman at the window gave us our food, Officer Pete handed mine to me through the sliding window between us, and we pulled onto the highway again. Mr. Wellington and Sanders were pulled over to the side of the road waiting. After we passed Sanders, I turned and watched him. His face was blood red, and his holding he was holding his hands up in the air and cursing the traffic. Sanders is mad back there, I said. What? Sanders is mad again. Officer Pete didn't reply. The judge chewed his hamburger slowly and swallowed. What's wrong with that man, Pete? Officer Pete shook his head. I don't know. We turned it onto a dirt road a few miles outside of town. I'd finished my hamburger, and even though my tongue still burned from the Coke, I wished I had 2 more of each. We didn't go far before we pulled over near a long, narrow cement slab with a roof over it. On the other side of the slab was a field with a dirt mound at the other end. Officer Pete opened my door for me as Mr. Wellington pulled up beside us. I got out and saw the judge strolling a few feet away from the car. With his back to us, he stopped and unzipped his pants and began to pee. Mr. Wellington got out of the car and walked up to us. Do you mind if I get a rifle out of my truck? Officer, it's for my demonstration. Your Honor, that's fine with me. Mr. Wellington retrieved a rifle from his truck and reached into his pocket and pulled out some cartridges. He began walking towards the shooting block and loading the rifle. When he passed me, I noticed that it was Pap's 22. Where'd you get that? I said. Moon, you stay quiet, he told me. Where's Sanders? The judge said. Just as he said it, I saw Sanders' car rounding a bend in the dirt road. He's coming, I said. He's probably got lost again. Moon, come over here, Mr. Wellington said. Sanders' car came to a stop behind us. I noticed wet grass and mud hung from the front bumper. He got out and slammed his door, and the judge stopped mid-stride and looked over at him. You got a problem, Constable? Sanders started to say something, but then set his jaw and shook his head and stomped around the front of his car. He got to his knees and reached under and felt around for a few seconds. I don't think his face could get any redder, but it did. He yanked and tugged until something bloody and furry came loose, and he stood with it and slung it out into the weeds. You're a dangerous man to be in front of, the judge said. Officer Pete nudged me forward. Let's see what your lawyer is going to do. Mr. Wellington was waiting with his back towards us. When the four of us were standing behind him, he turned and held out the rifle. This is a 22, iron sights, no scope. How much would you say you weigh, Constable Sanders? I haven't weighed myself lately, Judge. This is crazy. Guess your weight, Sanders, the judge said. Sanders breathed heavily out of his nose. 225. How tall? Mr. Wellington asked him. About 6 feet 2. Big target for someone 10 yards away. Sanders began to shake his head. Okay, lawyer. I know where you're going to go with this. You want to show me this kid can hit something 10 yards away, is that right? That's right. Sanders turned to the judge and raised his hands palm up. Didn't you ask him not to waste your time? What's this going to show? For one, the kid's not nervous like he was out there in the woods with me. Second of all, that's not a pistol, Judge. You know as well as I do that a pistol is a lot harder to shoot than that rifle. Wellington, the judge said, I agree. I hope you have more to show me than this boy shooting a 10-yard target. I'd gladly have Moon use the exact pistol he's accused of shooting at Constable Sanders with. However, it's evidence. And I don't think that kid's ever been nervous a day in his life, Officer Pete said. Mr. Wellington reached into his pocket and pulled out a small aspirin bottle. He held it up briefly for us to see. Then he turned and began walking across the field. After he'd walked close to 75 yards, he turned and shouted back to us. This far enough, Moon? I shrugged my shoulders. Mr. Wellington turned and kept walking another 25 yards. Finally, he stopped and pulled a pen from his shirt pocket. He knelt and stabbed the pen into the ground and stuck the aspirin bottle over it. There's no way he can hit that, Officer Pete said. That's 300 feet out. I give him your pistol, Officer Pete, Sanders said. Quiet, Constable, the judge said. I don't know anybody who can hit something that far away with a pistol. I heard Sanders shuffle his feet behind me. This ain't proving nothing, he said under his breath.
Teresa King,
Quiet.
I'm done in my
Mr.
classroom. This is Jeff. If
Wellington
you need
walked
to
back
come
to
and get your
us,
stuff,
picked
I'm
up the
done. Thank
rifle,
you.
and
Bye.
gave it to me. Shoot it, Moon. Want me to make him pay? Just shoot the bottle. It was nothing to me. I'd done it more than 1,000 times with Pat, practicing for the war he always said would come. I brought the rifle up to my shoulder and lined up the iron sights in the bottle. I held my breath and squeezed the trigger. The gun exploded and the aspirin bottle was gone. I let the rifle down and handed it over to Mr. Wellington. It was a few seconds before anyone said anything. Finally, Sanders spun around and started towards the cars. Where you think you're going, Officer Pete said. This ain't no way to run a trial. Bunch of tricks and nonsense, Sanders shouted. I saw the judge's face go red. You turn around right now. Sanders stopped but didn't turn around. The judge took a few steps to his direction. I'm going to tell you this one more time, mister. This ain't your daddy's Sumter County, and I ain't your daddy. This is my county and my trial. Turn around. Sanders slowly turned and stared at the ground and clenched his teeth. Look at me, the judge snapped. Sanders lifted his chin. I thought the judge was about to say something, but just then we heard a vehicle approaching. Everyone except Sanders looked out at the dirt road. I hung my mouth open when I saw Hal driving towards us in his daddy's truck. Just above the passenger seat window, the little wiener dog's head watched us curiously. In the bed, curled up on sacks of garbage, were the bloodhounds. Hey, Hal, I yelled. Hal waved at us, and the bloodhounds heard me and tripped around in the garbage trying to stand up. Recognize those dogs, Sanders? Mr. Wellington said. The judge looked back at Mr. Wellington and then at the truck again. The bloodhounds finally made it to their feet and began woofing at me. Sanders spun around and I couldn't see his face. After a second, he mumbled, "Some bee," and took out running towards the truck. Are those his dogs? The judge said. Yes, Mr. Wellington replied. Hold it right there, Sanders, Officer Pete yelled. Sanders kept on. Hal mashed the gas pedal and spun the steering wheel so that the truck leaned into a hard turn. The dogs crashed and stumbled around in the garbage, and newspapers and trash flew out into the weeds. Hal straightened up the wheel and sped out the way he'd come. Sanders kept after him for a second, but finally stopped in the road and stared at the dust trail. Put him in your car, the judge said to Officer Pete. Which one? With the crazy fool out in the road, that's which one. Book him for perjury, and I'll think of some more stuff before we get back to town.